introducing us to this, giving us a little background on the land use change tax and proposed change to the change tax. And it's been a while, so we probably need a little refresher, and I guess maybe you'll zoom out to start with. So, okay.
Yeah. For the record, Rebecca Samaroff, Deputy Commissioner, Vermont Department of Taxes.
I'm Jill Remick. I'm the Director of Property Valuation and Review at the Department of Taxes.
And yeah, that was a great intro. After our last visit here, where we were proposing a change to a portion of the land use change tax that relates to taxpayers who are pulling out just a portion of their overall parcel from the current use program. In chatting afterwards, it seemed like it would be helpful to zoom out a little bit and just talk about kind of like big picture, like current use, why there is a land use change tax, and kind of like some of the whys and what's going on in the rest of the country around similar programs and policies. So we're coming in today to do a zoom out view. We're not going to talk about our policy proposal much, but we can get to it if there's time at the end. And then, we'll work from here. So
I think what we'll do, if it works for you, is we'll let you tell us when a good stopping point is, and then so committee, you can just hold your questions. Okay, good.
That'd be great. Yeah, we kind of packed a lot in here. I can't figure out how to change slides.
There you go.
Oh, I got it. Okay, cool. Do you want to hop in with the purpose of current use?
Sure, right. And so this is all laid out in 32 V.S.A. 124. It's been in place in some capacity since the late 70s, early 80s. But the way the statutory purpose currently reads in the statute is essentially that it's designed to both preserve the working landscape, preserve the rural character of Vermont, and protect the natural ecological systems and natural resources of forest land. There is additional sort of verbiage in that introductory statutory purpose. And I believe the natural ecological systems has been added more recently. There is also language in there about property tax equity and prohibiting development. But this is sort of just big picture what the current use program is designed to do in Vermont. Right, and so right now, like we said, there's over 19,000 parcels that are in the program. The vast majority, of course, are forest acres. You can look at some pretty neat maps that FPR has that show the makeup and the division, which makes total sense. And you can see the number of parcels obviously is higher than the number of owners. There's owners that have multiple parcels in Vermont. There's also owners who lease land in the program to working farmers. So, but yeah, and the parcel count has sort of continued to tick up. As I mentioned, I think when we were in here recently, over the last few years, there's been a lot of changing of hands and transfers, and a lot of folks putting their properties into trusts and things like that. But despite the fact that there's only so much land to go around, the program has sort of consistently ticked up in its enrollment. And so as we articulated, when folks enroll in the current use program, basically there are eligibility requirements of how they can get into the program. And your enrolled acreage, the property value on your property tax bill is actually replaced by the use values that are set by the current use advisory board. So basically you're paying property taxes on a lower value. That's the construct. So each year, the municipalities are paid a hold harmless payment. This is a payment that we calculate based on looking at the tax rates and the valuations of current use enrollment. And then we actually calculate this hold harmless payment that we then pay out to each town that is supposed to keep the municipality whole so that they are not negatively impacted in their municipal revenue by current use enrollment. And so the most recent payment was 18 million, just under 18 million. And then again, because you're actually paying when you're enrolled in the program and your property value has been reduced, so your taxable value has been reduced, then we do calculate each year the foregone education tax revenue, which is about $47.5 million. So the total savings that landowners are saving is about $65 million. You should do this.
Yeah, totally. So, high level overview of the program, which I know you guys heard before from Jill and Elizabeth who work on the program. But if there's any questions on that review, we can chat about those. I think we're good.
Do you mind?
Yeah, no, Brian. Yeah.
I just wondered, looking at trends, do you see the sort of acreage involved not taking up too much, but the parcels taking up more because people are splitting?
That certainly accounts for some of it, right? Because there's only so much eligible property that will ever be eligible. Yeah.
We have a table coming up that shows both acreage and parcel growth over time, or maybe that table just shows acreage growth over time, but those are also ticking up as well. So it's not.
And we have that in the annual report. But yeah, the
Absolutely.
acres and the.
Like what would max enrollment be now?
I don't know that we've ever really thought about that because it's so dependent on what if somebody wants to be in the program.
But eligible acres, right, if you have to,
Yeah,
lots of 25 acres, right, not
right.
developed or municipal or downtown.
I know that Forest Parks and Recreation has done that analysis for forest land. They actually have a pretty neat map that shows here's eligible acreage that is not enrolled. So they do have that. For ag land, I'm not so sure. That's a good question.
So some back.
Sorry, Representative Libby.
Small question. Your second bullet ends with the term MD. What does MD mean?
Oh, sorry, Maryland. Yeah, Maryland was the first state.
Thank you.
Yeah. Starting with doctors across the country. But yeah, so good introduction, just a little policy history about current use. Much of this I learned last night from reading my Lincoln Institute of Land Policy book all about current use across the country. This was a real hot tax policy trend in the 50s and 60s, generally understood as a response to mass suburbanization after World War II. You can understand why Maryland might have been experiencing that a lot, being right in that DC belt. So they were the first to enact this, and then it kind of spread wildfire across the country over the next couple decades. And today, almost every state has some form of current use for agriculture, for sure. And then many of those states extended also to timberland, forest land, like we do. Less common are programs that hit other types of use like recreation, conservation, and open space. But now we're one of those states too with our new reserve forest land category. That's interesting. Some basics about the land use change tax that, we covered some of this in detail last time, but just to refresh, the land use change tax is a mechanism that's kind of understood to encourage more long-term enrollment of land in the program and discourage temporary parking of land there. You don't want a landowner, putting their land in current use if they do have intentions to develop it soon. It's kind of like what that parking concern is. The tax is actually due when the land is developed or if you wish to remove the current use lien on the land. But it's calculated upon withdrawal from the program. So we'll talk more about that on the next slide, but just noting the timing difference there. And the liability is 10% of the value of the enrolled land. And then as you all know from last time, in the case of a portion of a parcel, the liability is 10% of the value of how much you take out as if it was its own separate parcel. So new value from a local assessment official. And I just highlighted this point that withdrawal from the program is not the same as development. And this is the slide that I was referring to, by the way, that shows some increase in acres over time. No, this isn't the right slide. I'm so sorry. This is all about land use change tax. You're right. It's in the PBR annual report, which is linked earlier in the proposal. There's really great data in that report, by the way. So this is just kind of getting at this aspect that there's a lot of acres withdrawn from the program that don't have the tax liability actually due yet. You can see in the fourth column or fifth column over, acres withdrawn, land use change tax not due. These are folks who are no longer eligible for the program for one reason or another, but they haven't developed the land, but the lien hasn't been removed yet, so the tax isn't due to the state. You can see in the fourth column, the one just to the left, it's only about, it's like a fraction of the acres withdrawn are actually developed with the lien removal requested. And just to put that in context, we're talking 2.6 million acres overall. About 1% of that was withdrawn in 2022, and then 0.1% of the total was actually developed or had a lien removed request. And this kind of begs the question, why, why are acres withdrawn but not developed? Which is a question I had earlier this week and had some learning about that. Jill, maybe you're more equipped to speak to some of these situations.
So, there's lots of reasons why. And so when it's withdrawn, it means you're no longer receiving the benefits. So you're paying the full fair market value on the property. But the contingent lien is still on the property. So that's that slide before, the vast majority of the land that's been withdrawn has not been developed and the lien is still on that land. So why would someone do that? Well, the land use change tax is significant. So if you're not interested in developing it or doing anything different, you certainly don't have to pay that until you want the lien removed. But what we see a lot of times is there might be a transfer to a new owner. That new owner either may not be eligible or they may not submit their application. When property changes hands in Vermont, whether it's in current use or not, there's a property transfer tax return that's processed at the tax department. And one of the questions is the property currently enrolled? And do you wish to continue to enroll it? Depending on how people answer those questions, we send them a letter being like, hey, it looks like you just purchased property that's in the current use program. Are you still interested in enrolling it? Then you need to submit an application. If you're not interested in enrolling it, you need to submit a land use change tax form to withdraw the property. So of course, in a lot of cases, folks may not submit that paperwork, or they may not know if they want to continue to be enrolled in the program or not. They may need to wait a little bit to figure out what they're going to do. So a lot of times it's when property is changing hands, or we don't receive an application to continue the enrollment. We also hear from FPR, Forest Parks and Recreation, if there isn't a forest management plan that's submitted on time. And what we're seeing in a lot of cases is some properties are no longer eligible. So potentially they're no longer farming if it's agriculture. A lot of property has been owned by an entity, whether it's an individual or a corporation or out of state or whomever, but they lease to the farmer for like pasture land or crops. And because it's not an easy business to be in right now, a lot of folks are not able to find eligible farmers to lease their land, so that lease might expire. So a lot of property that might have been falling under that category are no longer falling in there because they can't find folks to do that work, or a farmer is no longer using it. And then there is also the annual agriculture certification. So that is an eligibility requirement under the statute. It's just a very simple form that we send out every year saying, hey, these are what our current use records show that we have in the program. Can you write back and confirm that you're still using it for this? If not, or if there are any changes, can you note it on here? And we send over 7,000 of those every year. And so that can lead to withdrawal from the program if they don't submit it, or what they submit back shows that it's no longer eligible, which is the point of that certification, is to kind of make sure that we have some sort of check each year for agriculture parcels. So those are some of the reasons why land might be withdrawn. So it's that they're no longer eligible for enrollment, but it doesn't mean that they've developed it. And so they're sort of sitting in this gray area, which the vast majority are. There still is a contingent lien on the property, but it's those folks are paying full property value.
Jennifer Brown?
Just a technical question. You need 2 acres for a home site?
For a house site, yep.
House site? So on the 25 acre, you need 25 acres?
You actually need 27.
That's what I was wondering, right? If it's 25 plus.
If it's under 25, then there's those, that you can have parcels enrolled that are under 25 acres if they fall under those income categories for farming. So that's where a lot of the smaller farmers with smaller acres, they are eligible based on that income piece only. But yeah.
But if you withdraw, say, from a bigger parcel, you still want to stay in current use, and you carve out your 2 acres, you need 27.
Yes.
Okay.
Representative Rice?
Is there somewhere where we can see the number of acres that have been withdrawn because the property changed hands, and then see whether those acres are going back in or not, or what percentage are going back in? It just seems relevant, particularly with so much property transfer over the last few years. It would be interesting to see, like, are these new owners enrolling back in and those acres aren't coming out permanently, or is there sort of a large scale movement away from enrolling those acres as the property's changing hands?
It feels like a lot of folks are trying to keep enrolling property in the program, but once they apply, we may determine they're not eligible. I think we've been hindered by having our access database and the way that we're managing the data. I think after this year, we actually would have a pretty good handle on how to get that analysis because it would be in our new system. But I mean, I've helped process applications to try to help my staff keep up and just to get myself familiar. And there are a lot of instances where properties change hands and they're very immediately filing to keep it in the program. Or they're maybe filing to put a smaller portion into the program. But hopefully when folks are interested in a property and they do a title search and they know that there's a contingent lien on there, that they're making that sort of informed decision about that. And they would also need to work out if they don't want the lien on the property anymore, and they don't want to be in the program anymore, someone does have to pay that land use change tax.
Right, yeah, is that something that usually falls to the seller, or is that just negotiated?
It's negotiated, yeah. Yeah, and ideally, right, so there have been instances where folks call us and say, I didn't realize there was a lien on this, and now I'm getting this bill from you guys. It's a hot potato. Once you purchase the land, that lien follows the land. So you want to make sure you have a good title attorney when you are buying land from current use, but yeah, I think that's like, I bet our staff has like a sense of that. But it feels like at least 50% continue to enroll, and it's probably more than that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see as the data, it becomes easier to see what these last sort of like post-COVID years look like.
Yeah, as someone who was in the Access database yesterday trying to answer my, questions that were popping up, I was like, oh wow, this is really, beautiful marriage of yesterday and today's testimonies, I think, of what we'll be able to do data-wise in the future.
Representative O'Brien, yes.
I just wondered, since a lot of the discussion was about the land use change tax, what you're saying though sounds like most people aren't developing, so that portion of a parcel would not really come into play, right?
We still have to calculate the land use change tax liability under current law, like as soon as the withdrawal happens, and that's like any of these situations. So all the work that's causing administrative burden and Jill's team and on municipalities and
landowners who want to.
Landowners who do want to act more swiftly, that's all still happening up front on that, what was it, like 23,000 acres? And I'm not sure how many parcels that is actually, but and that bigger share of property, that's still all that work's still happening, even though that liability that gets calculated is only used a fraction of the time.
But it seems like it'd be a lot easier for listers say, you withdraw 27 acres in current use, as opposed to you withdraw 27 and then you say you're gonna develop that 2 acres on it. Because that 2 acres, right, is a partial that the listers have to do their own calculation on.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Are you saying the way it's set up now is encouraging?
The way it's set up now, right, the listers have to do 2 evaluations or assessments, right? If you carve out, you pull a parcel out or you buy a parcel and then you want to develop a bit of that, right? That has a different assessment on it, right? So they sort of have to do twice the work for those.
That's true.
But what you're saying is most parcels are not identifying a developed spot.
Right.
So the listers don't have to do that work at the moment, they may down the road, right?
Well, they still have to do the work of valuing whatever's coming out. Yeah. And it depends on what the development is too. If it's actually creating a separate parcel, then they definitely will have to do that. But if they've already withdrawn and they've already set that value, then that work has been done, and that valuation would have included like a house site. So hopefully the lister would have that documented when the property is first coming out of the program. There's not an additional penalty. Once you've withdrawn it, we set that penalty. Upon development, oh, I see what you're saying, right. Upon development of the portion of that, that land use change tax is due. Gosh.
I was almost following the conversation, but I'm glad there's one light bulb up here. Do we have more question to massage?
So,
or should I move forward?
so I think so obviously we have not a stumper here, but everything that you've shown us so far applies to like any kind of withdrawal. So not subdividing or pulling apart portion out is like, this is all true for any time you withdraw property and then possibly develop it. But then we will be looking, the reason we're having a conversation is really about cases where you take some of it out. I think that's what you're going to be proposing some changes to, so.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And that is definitely what our proposal
Lovely.
focuses on. But for the purposes of this presentation, we can zoom out a bit just to talk about land use change tax more broadly. And we're about to get to other state stuff too, assuming that's interesting.
So Representative Graham and then Representative O'Brien.
So if you have a larger parcel, larger than 25 acres, the requirement that you have to make more than 50% of your income from farming. That's true.
For the under 25 acres?
For over 25, right?
Over 25 acres. If you have 100 acres or 200 acres, enrolled.
My read from yesterday was the income requirement is necessary for parcels below 25 acres, but is not a requirement for larger ag parcels.
And buildings.
Right, buildings.
So the income is just. I was told from the tax department that I had to submit income tax forms because I had to prove I was over 50% income from farm.
Were you enrolling buildings? Because the farm buildings also requires an income. That's how
I have buildings.
yeah, that's probably what it was then. Yeah, so it's the under 25 acres or the buildings.
Yeah, we're happy to talk offline about to resolve any confusion about personal tax situation for
So if you got,
Well, I'm just thinking, as all dairy farms and pushed out of milk production, it's harder to meet that requirement of more than 50% farm income.
Yeah, that's in the statute. I think that's something you folks might want to discuss. We won't.
Yeah, but they may want to still do some other form of agriculture with their land. But they get kicked out of the program because it's something that might need discussion.
Yeah, in the statute, it has a really specific, it's a IRS form and it's gross income. And so I that would need to get changed, but that's what we're using right now. And it is definitely, folks bump up against that.
Representative O'Brien and then Representative.
So just to be clear, if, say there's 100 acres of woodland in current use, and I want to divide off 25 acres of that, but not develop it, is that those acres are assessed all the same, right, by listers now?
Mhm.
So couldn't they just do sort of simple division to appraise what that 25 acres is, as long as it doesn't become?
Yeah, that's what we're trying to get back to. That's what we're proposing, is that they could have some sort of a equation or proration or something based on the value, rather than each time it comes out, there's a separate valuation that has to happen. Yeah.
And that was the situation for partial withdrawals before the 2015 reform also. Like in that situation, it would have been exactly like that, proration of the value of that 25 acres with a 10% penalty applied. And today, since it's being valued as a standalone parcel, you just as normal valuation practice requires you assume there's going to be a 2-acre house site on that 25 acre parcel, and the value becomes much more dynamic.
Representative Temple.
I just wanted to go back to Rep. Graham's point about income. I was of the understanding, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the net revenue from the farm needed to be $2,000 or more to be able to apply for the agricultural use.
That's another one of in that statute.
In
which one I have in
addition
front of me.
to.
Yeah,
So-
so we
Okay.
have slides in here, but
Yeah.
I'm not good at navigating these slides if you want to try to find it.
So not only do you need to make over 50% of your income from the farm activity, but it needs to be 2,000 or
I
more.
think it might be an or.
Oh, okay.
If we can-
It's an or. Whatever's more or less, maybe.
Yeah, I wish I need a green book.
Well, if you don't have it, don't worry about it.
Representative.
Just my own history, I had a farm in current use. I was giving all my haylage away just to keep the fields, naturally fertilized and utilized, and always struggled. I wasn't getting $2,000 worth of value out of it. And it was getting harder to justify. I was almost willing to pay the farmer to, not only was they not making any revenue, anyway, and there was a window and I withdrew it, the whole thing, because, I did not want to be fraudulent about the transaction. I was giving the crops away year after year.
So
It's easier with
we,
farm.
I think we can sort of compartmentalize the changes that we may be suddenly thinking of that we want to make to current use statute and set those aside. We can come back to them and maybe we'll feel that we want to do a bill and we'll have a better understanding of the program as it currently exists. But why don't we see whether we can get through some more of the background here.
Great. Oh yeah, and this just came up naturally, but I thought we'd throw in just a reminder of what the land use change tax was prior to the 2015 reform, which was a liability of 20% on the value of enrolled land if it had been enrolled for less than a decade, and then that penalty reduced to 10% in years after that. So this is like a sliding scale style penalty, which we'll talk about when we get to other states' stuff. And in the case of a portion of a parcel, as we just described, the taxable value is calculated just as a prorated portion of the parcel. So some of this is like, we did some forensics looking at kind of like email correspondences, like from around the time of this 2015 reform, but this wasn't on my radar, at least when I was at the tax department, though, just in a different role. But some of the strengths of the program, which we'll hear about later in the presentation too, is that having a sliding scale like this, where there's a bolder penalty in the early years, like pretty much directly encourages longer term enrollment, because there's like a real difference if you're just going to park your land for 2 years, you'll hit a much harder penalty than if you like really commit to conserving your land for a period of time. So that was a perceived strength. Some of the concerns with the land use change tax at that time and what may have, encouraged this reform is that the prorating acreage for partial withdrawals was seen as generating a penalty that was too lenient, especially for larger enrollments, because of that kind of like bulk value of land reality, where if you have a really big parcel, then your per value acreage is smaller compared to if you have a smaller parcel.
Can you just stop there for a second? So would that logic apply to withdrawing a small amount, a small portion of the parcel, or is it equally true across? I mean, it seems like it wouldn't be equally true across any proportion of the parcel.
It's true about property valuation, and it kind of like applies differently in those two scenarios. If we're, in the, old world where you're prorating the value of a whole parcel just for the piece you're taking out, then that piece will be that proration will have like a smaller value if it's coming from a big parcel than a small parcel. So that's just like math. But in the current world, I'm not an assessor, so I don't want to make a huge assumption, but I assume that, if someone's doing a standalone assessment of a partial withdrawal, they're like, okay, this is like a big parcel, so the per value acre would be X. But I should say the per value acre doesn't really matter right now because it's having that standalone value. So they're looking at it in its entirety. There's no proration. The proration isn't really like relevant in current law.
Well, yeah, and in any case, what we have here is not current law. So the strengths and concerns were debated in 2015.
Yeah. So this is
moved to something else.
Yeah, trying to like set the stage for why we think we got to where we are, and I think valid concerns, and I think as we said last time we were in here, like the design of this policy like makes a lot of sense even to us. It's just like the administrative realities of it, which has been so cumbersome and like untenable for Jill's team. I just thought it'd be interesting for folks to hear what other states do about development in their current use programs. I'll try to get through this stuff really quick, but it is really interesting. So let's hop in if folks have questions about it. 21 states have no development penalty at all. If you remove your land, so your only penalty is that you're back to paying normal property taxes. Every other state has adopted some variant of a penalty, and they kind of fall into two main buckets. And the general like purpose of these penalties is like one, to recapture some of the foregone property taxes that it's not always the state, it's often like the county or another municipal entity has, foregone from this. And also discouraging development, kind of the purpose of these. And the two main styles are a conveyance style, which is a percentage of value, which is what Vermont falls into, both the old policy and current law. And then there's also more of a rollback style, and that's where you try to claw back like the delta between what you paid under the program and what you would have paid if you weren't in the program for a number of years. We'll just go into a little detail on that. So conveyance states like Vermont collect a penalty based on the market value of the property when it's developed. Sometimes the rate declines with years of enrollment, and that's like our former policy where it started at 20% and then shifted to 10%. As of 2014 data is the last time I could find like a big count, but it was 6 states, including Vermont, who had this style. It was interesting that it's mostly like on the two coasts. It's not like the agricultural heartland. So I haven't like fully thought through the why of that, but just thought it was interesting. Connecticut and Rhode Island are two other examples of states that use kind of this sliding scale penalty. It's like a more robust penalty in an earlier time period, and then lesser in the out years. The other type, which is much more popular, are this rollback type, where 25 states have penalties like this now, where they collect the tax savings for a certain number of years right before development, and they often add interest to that as well. And there's some overlap here because 4 of these states have no penalty for an ag situation, but do have these rollback penalties for the forest land, timberland, other categories. I found ranges of like 3 to 10 years in terms of how many years of deferred taxes you were asked to pay back. Just for example, there's lots of kind of like iterations and forms of this. So for example, New York has a penalty that's based on your most recent assessed year, but multiplied by 5. And then they also add 5 years of 6% interest to that. So it's kind of like the last 5 years, but they just treat the last year like it was 5 years. I mentioned this Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. It's a respected think tank in the Boston area that nonpartisan and, just aims to inform state land policy with research. They write really great material. So they weigh in on this stuff, and just in case it's interesting to the committee, the Lincoln Land Institute definitely was bummed out about the 21 states that don't have a penalty. They basically see this as, a situation where eligible landowners can pay much less property tax than, homeowners, for example, without any financial pressure to actually delay development. They recommended a strong withdrawal penalty that declines with the length of enrollment. They point out that this really encourages longer enrollments because there's as I said a little bit earlier, there's a real difference for a landowner if they're gonna, withdraw from the program in 5 years versus like 20 years if the penalty is steeper in that earlier window. I thought it was interesting that they cited Vermont, but our old policy, I wanted to make clear, in 2014 is having an example of a really well-designed penalty because they do favor this, sliding scale format. And in the rollback states, they really liked the models that were more robust, like had a 10-year payback window. They thought the 3-year models were weak. They also said California's structure for a land use change tax was very strong. Theirs is a little unique because they actually require a 10-year contract when you enter in their program, and that contract is really difficult to cancel. And then there's a penalty of 12.5% even if you just let that contract expire. So it's not, the penalty definitely applies if the contract expires, but then if you're in a situation where you're able to cancel the contract, there's additional penalty as well. They do note that there's a trade-off here, though, that like the binding nature of this commitment could discourage enrollment in the first place. That we weren't able to find just, in happy to do more learning about this, but not a lot of information about how partial parcels are removed in other states. But California was one state that it did happen upon this, and our policy analyst Kirby Heaton happened upon this, and it's very similar to Vermont's program. But our policy analyst pointed out that because removal of a parcel is so difficult in California, the need for the local assessors to be doing these very hands-on valuations. And in California, there's like a lot of requirements, so they have a lot more work to do actually. But since it's so hard to do, they just do a lot fewer of them. Whereas in our situation, we're sending folks out to calculate on every withdrawn parcel, even if it doesn't end up getting developed.
Representative Rice?
Did they offer, is there a preference between conveyance and rollback from the?
I think, this slide might speak to it. It seemed like they really liked the style of conveyance where there's a big penalty that gets lessened over time. And like a question that like my first reaction to that was like, oh, why wouldn't they just want like a big penalty that's big all the time? But I think their point, which the slide kind of speaks to, is that like these use value assessment or appraisal programs are effective in delaying development, but like no one in the policy world claims that this is gonna defer it forever, which, it's like a sad thing to think about, but also there's other policy tools that can defer it forever, like conservation easements or public acquisition or, other types of things and programs that, delay development, keep land around that much longer for, other policy mechanisms to, do their work. So, and I don't, that's even like, not sure if it's the policy goal to delay it forever, that kind of thing. But I think that that's why they really like that format of a firm penalty that after like a 10-year window, say, would diminish over time. So there's a really clear incentive to like keep it in for a long period of time. That's kind of what they think the highest outcome of a good UVA policy would be. Use value appraisal or current use, as we call it here in Vermont. So that was kind of their big takeaways that I wanted to hit too. But Lincoln Land Institute is just one set of experts. We also have a lot of people that have been thinking about this here in state for a long time. I know Jill has flagged some of these stakeholders as folks that would be especially interesting to hear from in this space. I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yeah, and in addition to, so John McLean is the chair of the Current Use Advisory Board. They set the values that are used every year. They're a statutory board that's made up of municipal officials, foresters, agriculture folks, and then representatives from each of the agencies of Forest, Parks and Recreation, Tax, and Agriculture. And so their chair, who's been their chair for a long time and is a working forester, would be very happy to come in and just talk through what he's seen over the years with current use and what he sees as some of the negative impacts of the current structure. Jamie Fidel from Natural Resources Council, they were very in favor of the change in 2015 and are interested in sort of helping us navigate how to address this in a way that doesn't, reduce the penalty, because they think that's really important. Keith Thompson, I know you folks have heard from, he's the private lands program manager at Forest Parks and Recreation, and he and his team with the county foresters work really closely with our staff to administer this, and they're also very in favor of finding some way around this right now because the current structure is really pretty problematic. Then there's other folks that we listed on an additional slide. So we've talked to the League of Cities and Towns. V.S.A is the Assessors and Listers Association. I'm talking in a couple weeks to the Woodlands Association again. We talked to them. I presented to the Farm Bureau. There's a Municipal Clerks and Treasurers Association, which is kind of interesting because they're the folks that deal with the liens and the lien releases. And then of course FPR, Agriculture, and the Current Use Advisory Board, like I mentioned. So we're happy to provide individuals, but also these entities would certainly love to come in and talk about this more. And they may not all agree with everything we're proposing, but they all want to participate in finding a better way to do this, because I think everyone agrees right now it's pretty problematic.
Representative O'Brien.
So you mentioned earlier that when there's a partial withdrawal,
I know.
there's so many things, that there's an assumption there's gonna be a house site on it?
It's
Is
like-
that in statute or a PBR or listers do this?
It's a listing practice. If there is a place that could be a house site, they need to value a house site.
And leave that out of the program.
Part of highest and best use for any parcel.
So if I just wanna keep it forest land, I'm like, I'm never gonna develop this, they're still assuming there's gonna be a house site there?
Yeah, I think that's how they have to value all properties. You sort of have to figure
Right,
out.
cause that would certainly change the assessment on
Mhm.
those 2 acres.
Representative Lipsky?
They may also require that it have in the deed, a right of way of a certain width or road frontage. But in my actions, have had to provide rights of way, deeded rights of way
For the parcel or for the potential house site?
for the parcel. Otherwise, you're creating a landlocked parcel that has no access. And they've been trying to eliminate those for a century or more. Under current law, you used to have to, if you had a landlocked parcel, you could go to the local select board and have them actually stake out a right of way across a butter's land so you could access that. And it, obviously that was problematic to a high degree. So I think now they are requiring that you cannot create a landlocked parcel without right of way.
And Representative O'Brien, I've had some time to realize your point, question, and you're absolutely correct that, and this happens a lot, which is why our maps are so important, is that someone can withdraw a pretty good portion of their parcel and then they develop pieces over time. So you might withdraw 25 acres and then 5 years later you might develop a 2 acre. You have to pay the land use change tax on that because you're developing it. But the lien remains on whatever else you're not paying it. And so we have to keep track of, as they're developing portions of withdrawn parcels, we keep track of that and they have to pay that land use change tax on that. You're absolutely right.
So if you subdivide over 20
Yes,
years, it's a
over-
lot of work for the listers.
Yes. And current use and making sure that the entitled attorneys and folks looking at the records, yes.
I'm not sure whether you wanted to cover like the next 3 slides before we get to the ones we've already seen, or how did you?
Yeah, so I think this is where so a little bit of sources. And then I think this was just, wow, I didn't realize there was graphics on this slide. I'm enchanted. Yeah, this is our communications director sneaks in beautiful things sometimes. I don't know if this was helpful for some of the questions you were dealing with before, Jill.
Oh, yeah, here it is.
Yeah,
If it's less than 25 acres, the owner has to be a qualified farmer, which means or leased to a qualified farmer, or they have to have $2,000 a year of income from the sale of farm crops, right?
right.
And sometimes we've raised that maybe that number should change because that has been 2,000 a year for more than a decade. So you might be an individual who's very capable of paying your full property taxes, but if you sell, $2,000 worth of eggs on the side of the road or something, then you can qualify. But we did talk to Agency of Agriculture and they're like, no, there's very clearly farmers for whom that is an important qualification for them to stay in the program. And so that has stayed that figure for quite a while.
So on that, the way that the slide is formatted, it's a little confusing with the bullet point there. So at least 50%, is it an and or is it both? I mean, somebody making $2,000 a year from farm income and it being at least 50% of their gross annual income, they're not making very much money at all, right? So is it and or?
So the $2,000 a year income from the sale of farm crops is different than being a qualified farmer. So the qualified farmer is this 50% gross annual income.
Right, thank you.
So there are things that are not crops, but you're absolutely still a farmer, right? Dairy is not a crop. Right. Yeah, sorry, that is.
It's interesting that one's really coming out of RAPS and the other one's an IRS definition.
Yep.
Yeah. And then I did append our our former presentation to the end of this in case we wanted to, get into reviewing any of that. But I know that you guys are time limited today, so I just wanted to provide some more sense of overview.
Yeah, I think what might be good is to, if you can take like 5 minutes to summarize, if it's possible, with the proposal without going into into details. And we'll, I think, so we've got some other witnesses who we're probably going to want to hear from, and then we can have you come back again if we need to, just to be clear on the proposal. But we've got it all in the slides.
Yeah. I think we,
Right, so the construct for current use, we definitely are not proposing any change to current use or how the benefits are allocated or eligibility or anything like that. But when the legislature made 2 significant changes in 2015, it really, which I think were very well intentioned. And I think if all systems were operating at 100%, I think it would be doable. But that creation of when it's a portion of a parcel requiring that valuation as a separate parcel, it's created sort of, and this is why we originally sort of were running up against it, just because a lot of times there's not enough or any listers or assessors at the local level to do this work, or we might not hear back from them. And so we spend a lot of time trying to get this information. It also means that those landowners or potential landowners don't have any idea of what that penalty will be until after they've committed to withdrawing the parcel. So that creates this, not only is it delay, but it's all after the fact when it's too late to change your mind. So if everything worked perfectly and those numbers could be provided to a landowner within 30 days, that's at least something, but that's not how it's functioning. So from a landowner perspective, you can't make a decision until after you've committed to withdraw your land from the program. Or purchasing property, you don't necessarily know what that's going to be until you've withdrawn from the program. And then in addition, the more we dug into the data, as we wanted to come and talk to folks about, we'd really like to go back to what it was pre-2015 with some changes to reflect the need for the penalty to stay high. The more we dug into the data, the more that we saw that it's really incredibly inequitable in how different landowners are being treated in the state right now. So it feels like the more we sort of turned those rocks over, the more it felt like this really was problematic, not just from it would be nice to know this information, it would be nice to be able to turn this around for folks. It would be nice to always get these values on time for landowners, but actually the way that it's being administered is not happening in a standard way across the state. And so we really felt like that was like an additional red flag we wanted to raise. So our initial reaction was we'd really like to go back to that proration for pre-2015. That it was considered a good standard by the Lincoln Land Institute, and it changed over time, right? So it rewarded longer term enrollment. It was very easy for folks to calculate what that penalty would be. But knowing that the 2015 changes were designed to make the penalty higher, we've been trying to sort of address that by having this tiered or, equation-based tax rate, so that because we are agnostic about what the penalty should or shouldn't be from a policy perspective, we just wanted to have it be something that could be done, that could be predictable. Is that helpful?
And I do want to add to what Jill said. You talked about tiered or formula based, and part of that's based on your input when we were in here last time, Representative Rice, because your point was well taken about the cliffs in our proposal. That with so few buckets of tiers based on parcel side or withdrawn portion, there could be some misincentives within there that could result in a situation where a landowner would withdraw more property to reduce the land use change tax. So our data team right now is working on a smooth algebraic equation version, which I'm very excited to see the results of. I expect that in tax policy changes, we often talk about winners and losers. In this case, in the case of a personal income tax, sometimes those are, harsh terms, but easy to wrap your head around. Sometimes those are the same individual from one year to another. So in the case of the land use change tax, these are kind of ideally once in a lifetime event. So it's not winners and losers are someone who used to be winning under the program and is now losing. It's just, I think we will see a lot of difference between how a similar parcel today would be taxed Under current, a similar parcel would be taxed under a proposal versus current law. If we use something that's, super smooth and elegant, but, that's, our goal is to propose something that's revenue neutral, to not rock that vote and just try to, as Jill said, make it, something that could be calculated, something that isn't relying on a lister or assessor, doing work that's kind of outside of their normal cycle and practices that could result in these arbitrary outcomes for taxpayers, and hope to have an opportunity to preview that or reveal that, debut that, that's the right word for you guys, if there's interest.
Will we see language then from the department?
Yeah, so I think
The language proposed?
I think that the first time we were in here, and
I was just looking down through the slides to see if it was.
it's not in the slides, but it might be under my name for the first
Okay.
Presentation. But that was language that articulated this tiered rate structure where there were different buckets for withdrawals and different size withdrawals and different size enrollments. So that language is there, and that would have to be adjusted if we ended up changing those buckets or turning it into something smooth.
It's hardly endorse the idea of no cliffs if we can avoid it and use
I agree.
instead. Yeah.
Has there been any consideration to adding back in the length of time piece so going to something like this proposed, or perhaps one without cliffs, but then also having the penalties be increased for something pulled out in less than 10 years or something, so whether it's a third axis or it's just a 10% added if under this amount of time, has that come
I
up
think
at all?
that, if that was something that the committee was interested in, I think that just it'd be really easy to apply different rates for different times, just on top, like that smooth curve would be to determine the taxable value, and then a rate could be applied on top of that in whichever way.
Only because that seems like one of the features of the old plan that received positive reviews from.
Right, yeah. And I think that's a really interesting policy discussion to have. I'm certainly, having learned a lot more about it since the last time I was in here about what's going on in other states and what property experts are saying about it, it seems intriguing, but I don't want to, I know there was a very robust discussion around this in 2015 when we moved away from that. And I just don't want to speak for all current use and land use change tax, minds of our state. Or in your department, much less.
Yeah, I love that. I really appreciate we've had the time to talk this through with folks, but there very quickly becomes like policy discussions that you folks should have, or that you want us to consider, and that's one of them, right? We tried to mimic what was intended in 2015 with so that we weren't changing the policy, but there's definitely,
So in terms of our moving forward with the conversation, would it be maybe better to wait until you have an updated draft with whatever changes you're working on to the grid before we dig into this even more?
I think that would be great, with the caveat that if you think that the committee might be interested in layering another policy element on top of this, like what Representative Rice is discussing, and then also had thoughts about trying to maintain the revenue neutrality, as we have first another thought, that would be helpful to let our data team know, as early as possible.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'm just trying to figure out whether the chicken or the egg should come.
Right, totally. Yeah.
I mean, and as you have time, I think it would be great for you folks to just start to hear from other people besides us about this one or the other. I know there's plenty of witnesses who would love to come in, and I'm including names that may not agree with what we're proposing. I'm sharing those too, so that you can have those conversations, because I'd hate for you to just keep hearing from us and not hearing from
no, I think that's probably a good idea then. Let's get one more question in and then we'll get a little break.
Thank you. You mentioned John McLean. I know, I haven't seen him in years, but no, you know him pretty well, and Keith Thompson. I'm assuming both those professionals represent the forest component, woodlands aspect of current use more than agriculture.
So there's equal a number of ag folks on the current use advisory board. So certainly Mr. McLean's background and experiences from the forestry perspective, but the current use advisory board is very much made of both. And the Agency of Agriculture would, I know Diane Bothfeld just retired, but there's other folks at ag who.
But you had mentioned that John specifically had issues with the current law, so would you think he would be a valuable
I do,
person to
and
witness or provide testimony?
the current use advisory board overall did vote on a language of support for this proposal.
And then
as a whole.
the other thing, we are here for policy, and this is switching more to ag, that you should be aware. We have had a lot of very good and compelling testimony from what might be considered transitional or new farmers who have not been beneficiaries of a legacy transition of ownership. They are without land, but with a lot of passion and desire to contribute to the agricultural community. So one thing, this is more to our committee, we need to be very aware that, and there's also a housing crisis, in case there's anyone in the state that isn't aware of it, for old and young, that 27 is a very critical number compared to 25, unless someone has another place to live, which many folks do not. So I just think it's a policy for us who do advocate for new farming initiatives and opportunities. Need to be aware of that.
Great. Good. Thank you for bringing this back to us. And I think so I did get those names, 3 names, and we'll reach out and see whether we can, I'm sure there'll be others who are interested in testifying. And we need to take a break. We have a couple of, so we're not planning to go into the afternoon. We're not going to meet again after lunch. We'll take a short break, and then we're going to come back and have a little bit of conversation about the budget items that we've been asked to support, weigh in on, just to make sure that we all know what they are going into the weekend, can ruminate it on over the weekend, and then